Hello, Dr. McDonald, and thank you for leading our session on concussion today and agreeing to answer a few questions for us. To get started, what are some symptoms of concussions and how would someone know if they had one?
So the diagnosis of concussion comes through that with, it's a clinical diagnosis with a healthcare provider. And so it's based on signs and symptoms and physical exam, as well as the history that the patient will give that provider. And so some of the symptoms that we see with concussion are headache or dizziness, difficulty concentrating, nausea or potentially vomiting, as well as sometimes some mood changes like irritability. When we think about there's going to be an injury that is related to a concussion, so they have an injury to their head where they hit their head, and after that injury they are having these symptoms. So with a concussion, one of the things that we think about is some people assume that you have to have a loss of consciousness with a concussion, but that's not necessarily true. Just because you didn't lose consciousness doesn't mean you don't have a concussion. And so loss of consciousness only happens in about 10 to 20% of concussions. So if we think about all those other concussions where someone has an injury and then afterwards has a headache, feels a little bit dizzy, a little bit nauseous, those can be signs and symptoms of concussion. And so definitely they need to see a healthcare provider to get that diagnosis, because that's the way it'll happen.
Interesting. So are all concussions the same, or are concussions riskier for different age groups?
So no concussion is the same. No one concussion will be the same for across individuals. Everybody will have a different type of response or display of signs and symptoms of their concussion, as well as their recovery period and how long it takes them to get back to themselves. And so we are seeing in the data that children and adolescents are diagnosed with a concussion at a higher rate than adults are. And so we're seeing it more often in that child and adolescent population. And so when we think about recovery then, we see that children can sometimes take longer than adults in their recovery. So children and adolescents can take a little bit longer than their adults counterparts in terms of how they get back to themselves, that their symptoms subside over time. And so those that may be at risk for a concussion are potentially those that are engaged in contact sports that have higher rates of concussion. Just because you play those sports doesn't mean you'll necessarily have one, but that may present a riskier time for an individual.
Great. How do you treat a concussion?
So after an individual or a child or adolescent gets their diagnosis of a concussion with their healthcare provider, what will often happen is a time of what we call cognitive rest. So it'll be a time where we get brain rest. Any energy that they would spend on other things like their schoolwork or activities or physical activity, we need to take that energy and put it towards healing. And so giving the brain time to rest often involves sleep. And so you don't have to wake up an individual who has a concussion to check on them. That time of sustained sleep or continuous sleep will help them in terms of healing with their brain. So after a little bit of time, which can be different for across individuals, but sometimes within a day or two, you start to increase activities. So that may be engaging in a little bit of schoolwork or increasing physical activity a little bit to see how it can be tolerated. Or if engaging in those activities makes symptoms increase. So like that if you start to do a little bit of schoolwork, that they may increase in their headaches or dizziness. And so after individuals are tolerating those slowly increasing activities, they can get themselves back to their daily activities. One of the things that we think about for children and adolescents is returning to school. And so after a short time of cognitive rest and they're able to tolerate some school-related activities or some thinking, they may go back to school, and it may be an abbreviated schedule to see how they can tolerate that time. And so that may involve that they go to school and are in classes, but maybe they're not looking at the laptop that is in the classroom. They're just looking at printed materials, or they're not doing gym class because they're not ready to return to that physical activity. And so as they're able to tolerate over time, they'll work with their healthcare provider to see when they can be cleared to go back to full activities. And so that's the best course of action to have, kind of that increasing and tolerating activities, and to see how signs and symptoms may be.
Okay, so should people avoid contact sports or similar activities permanently after getting a concussion?
So just because someone has a concussion doesn't mean that for the rest of their lives they will be permanently banned from contact sports. Certainly, they're going to work with their healthcare provider after a concussion to figure out when they can return to sports and when they can return to contact sports, because you may be able to return to non-contact before contact sports. And so for any given individual, if they're considered recovered and they don't have other risk factors, they will be able to go back to contact sports when they're working with their healthcare provider. So just because a concussion happens doesn't mean it has to define them as an athlete over their time. They definitely have to take time to recover, and the physical healing as well as the emotional healing that happens with a concussion, particularly with athletes. So taking an individual out of their sports can be really hard for some children and adolescents, particularly adolescents, because it's part of their identity. And so figuring out ways that can help them physically heal, that gives their brain time to rest and heal, as well as to deal emotionally with the changes that happen in their lives, is really important.
Can helmets prevent concussions?
So helmets are very important in terms of protecting a person's head and their skull, but they're not necessarily going to prevent a concussion. Yes, they can help to protect against a skull fracture or prevent a skull fracture. Helmets are really important for contact sports in those that use helmets, and we definitely need helmets to be worn, properly fitting ones. But just because someone's wearing a helmet doesn't mean it's going to prevent a concussion. If you get hit on the head and you're wearing a helmet, you can still have a concussion.
Great, thank you for that. So one last question. How did you get interested in your career path?
So I'm a nurse. I say I'm a nurse clinically as well as in my research focus. And it really is part of my identity. I am a nurse through and through. And so I knew growing up that I wanted to be in healthcare, and I knew I wanted to take care of people, particularly children and adolescents. And so I've had the opportunity to work as a nurse at the bedside in hospitals, in pediatric intensive care units, as well as pediatric emergency departments, and I was a school nurse in a high school. And all those clinical opportunities, I always was asking questions about why and how we can improve health of children and families, and what we can do to support them. And that's what took me down the research path. I had always had lots of questions that I was looking to answer, and I found that as a nurse researcher, I could answer some of those questions and help promote health among children and adolescents.
Awesome. Well, Dr. McDonald, thanks again for joining us and taking the time to answer our questions. We really appreciate it.
Thanks for having me.